Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on where you are. I'm Matt Bateman, the VP of Pedagogy at Higher Ground Education, and I am a trainer at Prepared Montessorian. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Angeline Lillard. She is a professor of psychology at UVA at the University of Virginia. She's an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the APA, the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science. She got her PhD from Stanford in 1991, and her research has been funded near continuously since 1993 from federal and foundation sources. She received the APA's Boyd McCandless Award for her contributions to developmental science, and her book, her really wonderful book, Montessori, The Science Behind the Genius, received the Cognitive Development Society Book Award, is translated into several languages, and is currently in its third edition. It was updated pretty recently, a few years ago. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. It is one of the books that I recommend the most frequently to people who are curious about Montessori and research. Professor Lillard has been a keynote speaker at many Montessori and psychology conferences nationally and internationally. And I'm very, very pleased to have her as our keynote. So please enjoy this talk from Dr. Lillard. Afterwards, she'll join me for a Q&A.
Right. Thank you all very much for having me to the Discovering the Child 2021 Global Education Conference. I'm Angeline Lillard from the University of Virginia, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to you today about some reflections I have on Montessori in the 21st century. And I'll also be telling you about some research results, both older and newer, that are pertinent to this issue. So over 100 years ago, Maria Montessori studied children, and she studied them with a fresh face. She studied them with the acumen with which Jane Goodall studied chimpanzees, seeing new things that others had not noticed before. And she was able to do this, I think, in part through her training as a medical doctor, to really get down to what is this that I'm observing without all the preconceived notions that many of us would bring to the task. She got many insights through this that modern science has shown are actually true, that modern science supports. Now, one of these is that extrinsic rewards are unnecessary to learning. And of course, you might expect this, given that children learn to sit up and crawl and walk and speak without extrinsic rewards. But people had decided that they absolutely needed them to learn school learning. Well, she was able to set up methods of school learning that removed the need for rewards, that intrinsic rewards of learning were enough, motivating in and of itself. She also noticed that if you give children an array of healthy choices, children can choose what they need for their development, perhaps even better than teachers can. If you think of it, a teacher trying to teach a whole class of children, they all have somewhat different needs at any given time. And so treating them all the same really doesn't work. But also, we all have a deep insight into ourselves that perhaps others don't see. And this has been shown with baby chicks, a study by Rovi Collier et al., where baby chicks were given an array of choices of things to eat, and they chose the things that were deficient in their diet. Well, many people have shown that this is similar in psychology, that infants and even young children will choose activities that are just above their current level, things that are challenging enough that they're going to help them develop, but not so challenging that their system just can't process it at all. So that's what we naturally gravitate to when we're given an array of healthy choices of things that are, at our current level, just above, and so on. And so that's another feature of Montessori environments that she incorporated into the system. Another thing that she noticed is that children can learn well with and from their peers. So if you let them choose when to work with their peers, they'll choose times in their development and times in their processing when that makes sense for them. And so Montessori classrooms have 3-year age groupings that allow children to learn from older peers as well as to teach younger peers. And both of those are known to be beneficial. I won't go into citations on this here. You can see them in my book, but Montessori classrooms allow children to be as social as they want to be at any given point. So early in development, they tend to work alone more because they don't have the social skills to work as well with others. But by the time they get to elementary school and beyond, they love working together. That's why in conventional schools, recess and lunchtime and things are the favorite times, because that's when they're allowed to do that. And in Montessori, they can do that all the time. So the insights I've just given you and many others form chapters of my book. And the reason that I pulled out these Montessori insights is because there's enough research in psychology and education to write a whole chapter on it. She had other insights that aren't in the book. So others might come up with a somewhat different set. But in the 2017 edition, the 3rd edition of my book, I added in concentrated attention as another insight that really helps development. And these other insights are discussed at length as well. So, and so I discussed these all in the book. What I've talked about more recently, because people will often look at these and say, well, what's the magic ingredient? What's the thing here that if we inserted it in conventional education would also be really good? And so in a 2019 article in Educational Psychology Review, I talked about how you can't just pull something out, that Montessori is really a system. And if I had to choose one thing that is more central, at least these days, I'm thinking that what it is the fact of self-determination. That self-determination is really central to the Montessori system. And you can think of many of its features as being either supporting self-determination, so you have to have that feature in order to be self-determining. For example, the work has to be interesting. If the work in the classroom is not interesting and children can self-determine, they can choose how to spend their time, they're not going to spend it doing the work. So it's crucial that the work be interesting, that you capitalize on the fact that children learn best when they're interested in what it is that they're learning in Montessori. And then other features are kind of consequences of self-determination. So for example, the fact that it's intrinsically rewarding. If we get to choose what we're going to do, we choose things that feel rewarding to us, and it's a consequence that we feel rewarded by it. So this article, which is freely available on the web, explains how it's all a system. You can't just pull pieces out. So I think that Montessori makes a lot of sense for human development because she was such a genius observer. She saw these things and then she created this system that capitalizes on these features of human beings. But I think it's particularly apt for the time that we're in now. It was apt 100 years ago, but I'd say right now things are getting really crucial. And one reason for this is many people talk about how we may be at a real tipping point with the environment, that the methane gases that are about to get released because of permafrost going away, that the changes in the percent of ice that reflects the warmth of the sun versus oceans, which absorb it, are going to create such a much warmer planet that things may really start to change. And there's a real need right now for humans to recognize that we are nature, that the earth and us are all one, and that we need to work together. And Montessori education embodies this vision. So the cosmic education curriculum of the elementary, but also the way that the primary sets children up for this by giving them the keys to the world, are really giving children that kind of integrated vision that is what we need to go forward and see if we might be able to allow this planet to continue to support at least human life. It will still support some kinds of life probably, but to continue to support our own species. Another reason why I think now is so important for Montessori is that it's really got social justice ideas embedded in it. Montessori was all about world peace, justice, respect for others, and children of all races, ethnicities, and income levels have been shown in research to thrive in Montessori, that it's just particularly helpful compared to conventional ways. I think part of this is that there is a respect for the children that is so embodied in the teacher that then bleeds out to the children respecting each other, respecting all human beings. And of course, this is part of the curriculum as children are studying how people in different cultures are meeting their basic needs. You also see it in the collaboration, that children are constantly working together and collaborating in the classroom. It doesn't mean it's always perfect. Children are children, but it is in the system to have social justice and be culturally responsive. And I've written about this a lot in an article that I'll be talking about later in my talk today. So to move on then, there are also other 21st century needs that I think Montessori really helps with. One is a spirit of entrepreneurship. Montessori has no right answers. You're not just trying to go to some bubble sheet and fill out the right test answers. It's about children discovering, about children making new knowledge. And we need that today. We don't have people coming in and setting up factories and giving people jobs. People need to come up with things. We still need people to have basic knowledge bases and basic skills, and Montessori still gives these along with so much more. And one of the things that I think the self-determination helps children with is finding meaning in their life. How do I make my life meaningful? What's a meaningful thing to do? If your whole life people are telling you, do this assignment, do that assignment, you don't have the opportunity to really go inside and think, what makes my life meaningful? What can I do to help with this world that I'm in? And so Montessori, by allowing for self-determination, helps children to do that and get us beyond this purchasing and discarding world that much of the first world, at least, is living in. You know, let's buy it off Amazon, use it, throw it away. And so we're just generating this pile of trash that's not really where meaning in life comes from. So I think Montessori does a better job here. And I'll give you some data later that could support that view. But so an important issue is there evidence that this is a favorable system? And how do we get that evidence? Well, the best evidence for something being favorable or not, when it comes to something like a school system, is lottery control studies. And why is that? Well, look at these two families here. So we've got this one family where the parents are closely involved in reading to the children, and this other family where the parents are reading their iPads and the child's just kind of staring off into space, wondering, why am I here? Well, the top family happened to choose Montessori schools for their children, and the bottom family happened to choose conventional schools. And if we look at these children later, we might see that the ones who went to Montessori are doing better than the ones who didn't. But we have no idea if that's because of the school system or if that's because of the environment that they had in their homes. So for that reason, it's really important to have lottery controls, because then you've at least got the characteristics of wanting your child to go to Montessori being the same. And you can then pretty well assume that these parents, at least when they entered the lottery to go to Montessori, were the same at that point. Now, there might be something about Montessori that changes parents, but that's okay because that's still part of Montessori education. So that's why lottery control studies are considered the best sort of evidence. And I'll say lottery control studies are very complicated to do. The ones that I did initially were earlier in the technology of doing lottery control studies. I still think they're good, but we're now working on one that's even better. But let me tell you about the ones that I've done in the past. The first was published in Science magazine. We were looking at 2 ages of children. There were over 100 of them in the whole study. The ones who by lottery got into Montessori went to an AMI recognized, that's Association Montessori International recognized public Montessori. That means that the teachers had this very deep, intensive 9-month-long training from people who themselves had pretty close to the equivalent of PhD study in Montessori in order to become teacher trainers. That's a very rigorous process in the AMI world to become an AMI trainer. And they had 3-hour work periods. They had a complete set of materials. They had consultants come in on a regular basis. So it's high fidelity Montessori. And the children who didn't get in by lottery were at other schools. We did not include ones who went on to another Montessori school, but there were ones who went to other public schools. A few went to private schools on vouchers and the like. And the lottery was entered when they were 3. So even though some were 12 years old, they'd entered the lottery to go to the Montessori when they were 3. And this is backed up. The outcomes in this study, we give a variety of social and academic measures. There was no measure on which the group in Montessori did worse than the others. They were either the same or better. When they were 5 years old, they were better on a wide range of academic and social measures. At 12, and these children started at the school when it was a newer school, at 12, they were more limited, but there were some academic measures having to do with writing and creativity, as well as social measures. So their comfort level at their school, for example, that were more advanced, higher, better in Montessori than in controls. Later, I went on in Hartford, Connecticut, to do a study with 141 children, about 70 in each group. And we followed them from the fall when they entered Montessori to when they were 5, when they'd finished the primary level. And this again was an AMI public Montessori, or children went to business as usual schools. The public Montessori in this case, and that means federally and state funded Montessori in the United States, it was actually a magnet school, and that means that it was trying to attract half of the children from outside of the inner city where these schools were located. So it had a very, very wide income range. And children were equal at baseline. And what we found was that by the time that they were 5, the Montessori children were doing better on a wide range of academic and social measures. And both of these studies are freely available on the web, so you can go and read them in depth. This one's at Frontiers in Psychology. But one result I want to show you from this study is looking at the lower income children. So I said it was a magnet school. There were some high income children. What about the lower income half of the sample? How did they do? Well, you'll see that at the first time point, it looks like they're a little bit different. It's not significant. That may be because we were testing them sometime over the fall, not the day that they started school. But so here's the first time point, the fall when they're 3. Then we go on to the spring when they're 3, and there's no difference. Here, the dotted lines are actual data. The blue is Montessori. The solid lines are a fitted line that gets put to the data. So what you can see here, though, is that by time 3, the end of the year when they're 4 years old, they're starting to pull apart. And by the end of the year when they're 5 years old, the lower income children are doing much better than the lower income children who did not get into Montessori. But what's also the case here is that they're approaching, I don't have the lines on here, but the higher income children who got into Montessori and the controls. So the high income Montessori were doing the best, then the high income who didn't get into Montessori, but then the Montessori low income are statistically caught up. They're starting to approach. The slope is such that they, if it kept going that way, would catch up to the higher income children in later years. So really impressive results for lower income children in Montessori. However, fidelity matters is one thing that I find increasingly apparent in my research. And I'd been suspicious of this just from going and observing schools. You can see schools where it's clear there's more true Montessori going on, and you also see higher levels of work happening in the children. But here's another lottery study, and this is a beautiful lottery study that's just come out in the journal Child Development. It was done in France. And I say it was a beautiful study. It had true random assignment where the children arrived at the school and they got assigned to one or another classroom. So they're all in the same school. They had, I think it was 3 Montessori classrooms and then several non-Montessori classrooms that were running the École Maternelle program, which is the standard French curriculum. It's known to be a very good early childhood program. And what they found in this study was that children in Montessori did clearly better on reading and literacy measures. But that was all they did better on. The whole array of other things they were equal on. So you may say, well, that's good enough. That's fine. It's pretty neat that they did so much better on reading and literacy. But if you look closely at this study, you'll notice some problems with fidelity. So this was not an AMI program. The teachers here were self-trained in Montessori pedagogy. So they trained themselves by reading books, by going and talking to other Montessori teachers and so on, but they hadn't gone through this thorough 9-month course delivered by people who themselves had been so carefully trained to be Montessori teacher trainers. They didn't have 3-hour work periods in the school, and they were missing many of the Montessori materials. Particularly, I noticed a lot of important math materials missing. They had many of the reading and literacy ones, but in general, they were missing a lot of Montessori materials. So fidelity may be why that was. It may also just be that compared to École Maternelle, Montessori is only better in reading and literacy. We need more research always. But here's a study that I did that suggested to me how important fidelity is. So we went to, I'm going to start with the green bars, classic Montessori classrooms. These were classrooms where our metric of classic Montessori was that most of the time, 4 observations during the year, almost all the children at any given moment were engaged with a Montessori material. Now, there were probably other things that made this high fidelity Montessori. I know those classrooms also had 3-hour work periods. They also had AMI trained teachers, which I'm just saying means really in-depth trained teachers by highly trained teacher trainers. And they had the consultants come in and all the other things. But the metric that we used was how much they were using the Montessori materials. The supplemented Montessori classrooms were more what I find in the United States a typical Montessori classroom looks like. So yes, they've got the Montessori materials, but they've also got commercial puzzles and lots of art projects and lots of fun things that you would see in any preschool classroom. So they're supplementing the Montessori with things that they think are going to help it and improve it. And then we had conventional classrooms, and these were selected as conventional classrooms that the parents at the Montessori schools said they would send their children to if Montessori were not available. And this slide just shows you school year change in executive function. So we went in and we tested, this is about 160 children, ages 3, 4, and 5. So across the whole primary, we tested them in the fall and we tested them again in the spring. And this is how much they changed, how much they grew across the year. And the measure that we used here, when I say touch your head, touch your toes, when I say touch your toes, touch your head, and so on. What you can see is the children in these classic Montessori classrooms changed twice as much as the others. And in later research, and by the way, this is only an executive function. We have similar graphs for how much they changed in reading, math, other kinds of things, social skills and the like. I don't think that it was just about the Montessori materials there. Just putting Montessori materials in a classroom isn't going to make the difference. But we did find in another study that just removing non-Montessori materials from a classroom increases the amount of growth that children have. So this was one school that in 2 of their classrooms, in the end of December, they took out all the non-Montessori materials. And in a 3rd classroom, they left the non-Montessori materials in. And what you can see is from January to June, the slope in reading and the slope in executive function is steeper for the ones that only kept the Montessori materials. Same teachers, same everything. It was just that difference. So what is high fidelity? I'm just going to point to a couple of articles that are also freely available on the web from the Journal of Montessori Research. Virginia McHugh and I, who was the former head of AMI USA, we read through Montessori's books very carefully and tried to pull out what did she think this system was at the end of her life? What did she think it was as a metric against which to measure changes when people change Montessori? So we had part 1 on the environment, and part 2 is the other parts of the triangle, so that the teacher and the child. And then also in the same issue, Cook-Glaser and colleagues created a logic model to inform Montessori research that also has some really important elements of Montessori to think about in it. There's a lot of other evidence besides what I've just presented. As I said, lottery studies have the most respect because you're equating the parent issue, and parents are the biggest influence on children. It's because of parents that children have the income that they have in the household usually, and that's just a huge factor, is how many resources are available to build this human capital of a child, and then how relaxed are the parents and so on. So those are the best, but there are other ways to do really good research. So Cook-Glaser et al. In South Carolina, looking at the test scores, were able to use children's pre-test and look at their growth in Montessori. So that's another great article. Denervaux has, with her dissertation, come out with a slew of open access articles, and I understand there's more to come, where she was looking at children from 4 to 15 in Montessori schools, and she's done fMRI and all kinds of things, and shown some nice results, and some of them are well controlled. Basically, we're just looking for how do we get more and more evidence to tell us how this system is for children. And you can download a lot of these for free if you go to the Google Scholar site, if that's available to you, and type in Cook-Glaser Montessori, Denervaux Montessori, Lillard Montessori, and you'll see PDFs for a lot of these that you can access. So now I'm going to tell you about some other research that's been coming out of my lab that's not as good in terms of, one could argue that it's just the parents, but it's hard to do lotteries all the time. And I think this kind of work is still useful. So I'm going to go a bit quickly in the interest of time here. One of them, we asked ourselves, well, maybe we don't really need to work on having more Montessori schools because maybe everybody just loved their conventional school so much. I know that's not true of everybody, but we thought, let's find out how much people liked the school that they went to, what kind of school it was, and what kind of features it had that made them like it or not like it. And this article, which is under review, we called My Name's Sally Brown because she's Charlie Brown's little sister and she really didn't like school. So my name's Sally Brown and I hate school. We had 730 people filled out online surveys. Their mean age was 35. The range was 19 to 77. They were 3/4 white, which is who will often fill these out. We limited it to US and Canada because we wanted to have a conventional system that we understood, and also because certain well-being sorts of measures vary by country, and these are 2 countries that are fairly similar. And we did a survey on how much people like school and why they like school. And first of all, we wanted to just sort of compare a metric where we asked about things like running errands, scraping your knee, and getting a special treat. And here the dark bar is people who went to conventional school, and the light bar is people who went for at least a period of time to a Montessori school. And you can see they're the same on those three metrics, but when it was, as a child, how much did you like school? People who went to Montessori liked school more. And what did people like the most about school? Well, people who went only to conventional schools said they liked seeing their friends most. And they liked it quite a bit more than they liked learning at school. Whereas for people who went to Montessori, they like learning at school just about as much, a little bit more than seeing their friends at school. So we think that's also an important data point, and there's much more in that paper, but let me move on. We also have a study that's submitted where we looked at people's long-term well-being. We had almost 2,000 adults, average age 36, 18 to 81 was the range. And a little less than half of these had attended Montessori for at least 2 years in their life. They had attended for an average of 8 years, so pretty long. And some of them, it was as little as 2, but some it was as many as 14. So in other words, their entire school life up to university had been at Montessori. They also took a set of online surveys. In this case, there were well-being surveys. These are common surveys in the whole positive psychology movement. It's a big thing in social psychology to say, what is people's well-being? That this is perhaps the most important life outcome. It predicts all kinds of good things, and from physical health, longevity, income level, and so on. And we factor analyzed the results for the whole sample for these 20-some measures that we'd given, and we found 4 latent factors. And other research had shown that features of Montessori produce or are related to outcomes that conceptually align with the factors that we found. So next I'm going to show you what those factors are. They're here under hypothesized results. I expect it's difficult to read what's on the left here, but this is just showing you at the bottom are the measures that we gave people in the online surveys, and how these are seem to be supported by these underlying latent factors of general well-being, which is tapping into happiness, your sense of competence, the meaning that you find in life, engagement, which seemed to be about, it was measures that seemed to be about seeking challenge, and social integration as being kind of engaged in your social world. Then there was a third latent factor of social trust, and that seemed to be how much you thought society was really a good place and you could count on it. And then self-confidence, and this was particularly confidence in your own thinking, your own thoughts and mind. And other research suggests that when people have more self-determination, they're higher on general well-being, engagement, and self-confidence. When people engage more in meaningful activities, they're higher in general well-being and engagement. And when people are in more socially stable environments, like Montessori has the 3-year age groupings and consistency with the teacher, their general well-being is higher and their social trust is higher. So this is kind of the rationale underlying this study. And we did find that people who had gone to Montessori for at least 2 years were higher, and these are statistically significant results for all 4 of these latent factors using structural equation modeling that accounted for the effects of age, because generally people's well-being increases with age until they get very old. Gender, some studies show one of the other gender has higher well-being. We controlled for ethnicity, for childhood SES, and for the number of years people had spent in private school. So despite controlling for all those other factors, and despite people taking these surveys at an average age of 36, well after they left school, we saw something consistent here. Now, it could be the parents. So these parents have all chosen a school for their child. We thought, what if we look just at the people who went to private school? So in other words, just people who particularly chose a certain school that they're going to pay their tuition out of their own pocket, typically, to go to. And it was still true for those who with a subsample who were just in private school had higher well-being. We also decided, well, when people stop going to Montessori, it's often because it's not available rather than because the parents no longer like it. Although sometimes it's because the parents no longer like it. So we looked at whether being in Montessori for longer also predicts higher well-being. And we found that it did for the first two of these, for general well-being and also feelings of engagement, finding, getting yourself really engaged in your activities, engaged in your social world and the like, were both higher the longer people had spent in Montessori. So again, possible that it's something about the parents in this study. But we argued that because the lottery studies show that people are on a trajectory towards this, because Montessori has many of the features that would predict this, and because of the analyses that we did, there's reason to think that maybe Montessori does cause higher well-being. We also have done a study of test scores, and none of us like these tests. I think most of us at least don't like these tests. But the fact is that children have to take these tests. They're considered very important in many countries to see how do children do on these bubble sheet multiple choice exams. So as I said, Colclasure did an excellent study of this in South Carolina, where they were able to get individual scores and control for prior ones. We didn't have access to that kind of data. What we did, and this is with my lab manager, Allison Snyder, and Cynthia Tong, my colleague who's a quant expert. So we went to state websites. States are required in the United States to publish publicly every school and every district's scores on these tests, and they have to have them in 3rd grade, 8th grade. They're often there for other grades as well, and they have to have them in math and English language arts, or reading, literacy, vocabulary. So those are publicly available. They are published as percent proficient, and every state gets to decide what's proficient, and every state actually is able to decide what test it uses. Many of them have their very own tests. But within a state, that's all the same. So what we did was we compared states to their districts in the percent proficient. And we went to the 10 states or regions in the US with the most public Montessori. There were 195 public Montessoris that had scores posted. And we compared the 3rd and 8th grade math and English language arts scores with the district. And we controlled for the percent non-white, because in the United States, that's also associated in general with levels of performance. And we also controlled for the percent that were on free and reduced lunch, which is an indicator of lower income, or in some places they called it economic disadvantage. So we controlled for this. Now, when you're looking at these results here, what we're showing you is the effect sizes. So that seem more meaningful when it's coming to percent proficient. So that's, how big of a difference do we see? And we're looking on the left-hand side, if a bar goes over that direction, it means the district was more proficient, had a larger, and with this effect size than Montessori. And on the right is where Montessori is better off than the district. And we've got overall, the Black subsample, the Hispanic subsample, and what they're calling the economic disadvantage subsample. We've got 3rd grade on the left and 8th grade on the right. And English language arts is red and math is aqua. So what we've got here is that in 3rd grade, children do better in the district on math. And many people say this makes sense because these are these bubble sheets that they're filling out. It's totally abstract. The children are still using the materials a lot and getting their fundamental understanding of math through the materials. This wasn't the case for the Black subsample. The Black subsample is doing better in math and Montessori. The others are the same in 3rd grade. In 8th grade, everybody's doing better. It's not statistically significant overall, but it's, or for the Black subsample because it's so small, even though that's a big effect size, there were not as many schools that were reporting data for that. And it's not significant for the other two groups. So that's math. And English language arts across the board significantly better in Montessori. So and another way to look at this is in the US, of course, we're really concerned about what's called the achievement gap, which is the difference in percent proficient between white and Black, or between higher income and lower income, called economically disadvantaged. And what you can see here, the blue is the Montessori. The gap is smaller in Montessori for the most part. The one exception, and it's not significantly different, is third grade math. The gap for Black and white was slightly larger, but not significantly. So Montessori seems to, in general, be really positive for even these tests. That, remember, Montessori is not trying to prepare children for tests. It's not based on these kinds of tests, but they still do somewhat better. Now, we don't really care about test scores, though, right? We're caring about development of the whole child. And in the United States, with this emphasis on test scores, there's also this big rise in no excuses schools that are all about test scores. The child can't have a button out of place. The idea is there's no excuse for not having all children do well, but this kind of feeds into, we're going to have very, very rigid rules for all children to follow, because we think that that's going to be helpful to having more children do well on these tests. And these are especially happening in urban areas, especially aimed at children of color, especially aimed at lower income children. So the question is public Montessori a good alternative? And I did the study. Of course, we've just looked at those test scores that suggest that it is, but I also want to think about all of development, the things that we really care about. And I was approached by Mia Seal about doing a study, an interview study, with people who had gone to actually a private Montessori school in Washington, D.C. In the years 1982 to 97, when it operated. It was an AMI recognized school that was in Ward 6 in Washington, D.C. That's near Union Station. At the time, it was a very borderline community with kind of dilapidated, broken down factories on one side and some government buildings on the other. The majority of the children at the school were Black. The head was Black, and the teachers and staff were also diverse. I think Black and another non-white ethnicity. This is a study that's now in press in the Journal of Negro Education, and it's available off of my lab website. So it was a qualitative study. We figured that about 120 people went through this school during the years that it operated, and we were able to locate 12 of them. So we tried all kinds of ways to find as many as we could. There were others that we found on Facebook and LinkedIn, but we couldn't actually reach them. However, from what we could see, they were doing as well as the people who we interviewed were. The people who we were able to contact to interview, 10 were Black, 1 was Hispanic, 1 was white, and we interviewed them at an average age of 32, a range of 25 to 40. And 8 were men, 4 were women. Some of these things I've already told you. They attended Mallow from between 1 and 3 years, a mean of 2.5 years. Half of them went on to other Montessoris, both public and private. So some of them's parents, for example, worked at a private Montessori. They were able to go there. Perhaps they paid tuition there. Several of them went to, there was already public Montessori in DC right nearby. There were, on average, these 12 people went for 5 years to Montessori. And all of them, how were they doing as adults? All of them at least finished college, except for one who at the time was about to, believe has finished by now. And current employment, they had great jobs. I'm going to push on through because I'm going over my time now. What did they get from Montessori? We asked them that question in our interviews with them. And they said things like, I do on a regular basis feel like so much of what I'm capable of, or even just the basic idea that I'm capable, comes from a very young age of people expecting me to be capable and allowing me to practice that. They talked about their academic preparation. Because I know you all can pause this and read them, and I know I'm getting short on time, I'm going to just let you all pause the video and read these and not read them all. But they spoke to their academic preparation. One of them, who had severe myopia, spoke to how having these large images on the sandpaper letters and also having hands-on material helped him. Many of them commented specifically on how the math materials helped them, and that they could see relationships in math that other people just can't easily see. And that later, at times, I found myself able to pick out other Montessori kids in a room in conversations, at times when we're having a discussion about something, just the specific way in which connections are made between things. That gets to that cosmic education, understanding the interconnection of the whole earth that we talked about earlier. They talked about the confidence, this relates to feeling capable, that was engendered by being in an academic environment like this, that then enabled them, when they were in more competitive environments, to excel. They talked about the self-direction and the importance of self-direction. One of them, this is a dancer, who said, as a dancer, you just have to figure it out. You can't, if something's not working, if you're not turning properly, you have to figure out why. There's not going to be someone to fix it for you. Montessori meant showing up as a partner in your own education. They talked about the social skills that they felt were engendered in Montessori, that, learning from the other students, teaching other students, but also one of them said, being kind to other people, treating people like you wanted to be treated, just basic manners and human decency was something that they felt they'd really learned about in their early Montessori classroom. One said about the environment, I just remember it was just a really good environment. Honestly, it was really like that environment gave me an idea of what I wanted. That routine, that schedule, socially, everything. That environment's kind of like something I've been trying to recreate ever since then, socially and academically and mentally fulfilling and tolerant. It gave me an idea of what a well-organized environment that was fulfilling for everyone could be like. So that's Mallow Montessori. I have 72 pages of quotes like that. It's not just the ones I've selected out here. They were just really resounding and really interesting. And again, you can read the article if you want to know more. And again, the names of the other 33 who we'd found, they'd gotten full scholarships at Carnegie Mellon and Northwestern. They're at Harvard School of Education or Yale Law School or Howard Medical School. I mean, one had their own private equity firm. So, they were all flourishing. We were just able to contact and interview these 12. All right, so to summarize what I've been able to tell you about, Montessori had insights that are supported by today's developmental science. Montessori also seems to prefer skills and understandings that are really ripe for our time. And Montessori also has outcomes that appear to be superior to what we have in conventional schools. So I applaud the mission that many are on to try to bring this to more children, to try to bring it to them with high fidelity, because lower fidelity we're less sure about. The big study that I'm doing now with the American Institutes for Research at Public Montessori's in the US, this other much larger national lottery study, will hopefully give us some more insight into just what features are the most important. But I do think we have to bear in mind that it's a whole system. I want to thank the Wind and Wildflower Foundations for their support of much of the research that I've presented, the more recent findings. The other findings were supported by other groups and are listed in the articles.
Hi, Angeline. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you, Matt?
I'm good. Nice to see you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and thank you for that lovely talk. A lot of that was new to me. I think I follow your work pretty closely, but there's a lot of interesting things that you and your lab are working on. We'll take questions. I'll kind of filter in questions from the audience. But while I'm waiting for that to happen, I'm going to take my selfish moderator's prerogative and ask you some questions that I would love to know more about. And most of the questions that I have are about the kind of nature and character of Montessori research. So what kinds of tools or resources do you really wish you had as a Montessori researcher? I think that there are lots of challenging things about studying Montessori. You mentioned a few, that it's a system, that it's hard to get randomized controls, there's a bunch of features that make it kind of hard to peel apart. Like, is there anything, like, do you wish you had access to like populations or samples, or even just better metrics for measuring tools from cognitive science? Or like, what do you yearn for in your work?
all the above. I would say, one of the fastest critiques that people give is that it's not random, that not only are the children not random, but the teachers aren't random. And so if we could randomly assign people to get Montessori teacher training, and then different types of training, and then see the children's outcomes. And of course, that takes a lot of time. And so, time is a big element here. All of it also takes funds. And so we're so grateful to those who fund. People who don't have a particular interest in Montessori just often aren't interested in funding it. The U.S. Department of Education has finally funded this big trial, but because of COVID, we had to throw away our first wave of data, because then the children weren't in the treatment anymore once they were at home during COVID. And so, we're just hoping we can get money to follow those children beyond age 4 that we're enrolling right now for starting in the fall. So that's big. But then, like we'd really like to know what the best child-teacher ratio is for child outcomes. And that kind of study is really difficult to do, because if you don't have a whole lot of classrooms involved, you're going to be looking at teacher and child effects. They're going to be contributing so much to whatever data you get that there's just not that much space for the ratio to play out. So that's why, like, the Tennessee Star study had, many schools. And so if there were many Montessori schools that were willing to try a ratio of 15 versus a ratio of 30 children for every 2 adults, say, and also if the teachers are both trained or just one's trained, and those kinds of questions, I think, would really be helpful to be able to answer. But it takes a lot of schools, and then it takes schools where their enrollment is comfortable enough that they can do that too. And only public schools often have that ease. So that's some of the things that I would really yearn for. But also I yearn for there to be a lot more good people doing the research. And it's starting to increase. We're starting to see more training programs, but people who really know and understand Montessori being able to go in and study it. Because if people don't really understand it deeply, they just miss a lot of what's important. Like, they'll publish studies, and then you'll read the report, and it says that the children moved from station to station, and that's just not an understanding of Montessori. But
right,
so we don't know then if it was poorly implemented or just poorly understood. So yeah, that's some of the things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, it's always nice having you at these conferences and talking to you. There are more and more researchers who are interested in Montessori, which is great. But for a long time, it's felt to me like you're a kind of singular figure in terms of the kind of quantity and quality that you're pushing forward. We have a follow-up just to something that you just said. So Susanna Martins asks, what's the usual child-teacher ratio? And maybe I would just love a little bit more context on why you're interested in this question. My sense is that Montessori and kind of her work in her classrooms had much higher ratios than the ones that we're used to, and that there are also regulatory issues around this now. And maybe you could just speak a little bit more to this question.
Yeah. Yeah, so first of all, in Montessori's day, it wasn't unusual to have huge classrooms. So reading about, like, some of the early public schools in Boston, there would be 250 children with one teacher, and the teacher would have some assistants, and the assistants were running around making children do their recitations. So it wasn't as unusual, but she talked about 50 or 60 children in a classroom, sometimes even 250. And I believe even today, Shannon Helfrich was telling me in Thailand, I can't remember if she said 100 or 250.
I've heard that too. I've heard like low hundreds in Thailand.
Yeah,
pretty
huge
common.
number of children with lots of assistants and a teacher, and that it works. So certainly it used to be more common to have many children with one teacher. Now ratios don't allow that. Part of this is coming out of this other way of viewing what happens in a classroom, which is that a teacher gives children information and checks that they learned it. And the very best ratio for that kind of learning is 1-to-1. So there's studies that show, the smaller the ratio, the better. So because we teach conventionally, that's led to all these state regulations that have that be the ratio. But if we had solid evidence that actually in a Montessori classroom, a different ratio leads to better outcomes, and we started to get, within government's education agencies, different regulations for this different kind of teaching, then we could free things up. And why would we want to? Well, we would want to if it actually leads to better outcomes. And Maria Montessori said that it did. That doesn't mean it necessarily does, but she had a lot of good insight. So I would, if I was a betting, person, I would put my money on that, and then we'd want to go check it out empirically. But so she said in her writings, and this is in the article that Virginia McHugh and I put out in 2019 in the Journal of Montessori Research, which you can go to their website and download, where we took out of her books, what she'd said. And she definitely said that it is better to have, she varied it in different places, but at least 25 children to the one teacher. And there wasn't always an assistant. She doesn't talk a lot about assistants in her writings about the classroom. So I don't think they were there a lot of the time. And other places, she said you really should have 35 to one adult to get really good outcomes. So, she certainly was pushing for more. I've talked to people at Montessori schools today who say that dealing with the children's fine. It's the parents that's so problematic. If you have a whole lot of children and they're not siblings, that you get so many parents to cope with. But that's going to vary by culture.
That's going to vary by culture, and that's also a problem that might be able to be solved in any number of ways. It's so interesting. Periodically, not that often, but periodically I will talk to a Montessori teacher, especially a season one, but not always season ones, who really report like sometimes things really go better when you're a little bit overwhelmed and you have more students and you have kind of fewer assistants. There's a kind of judgment that like in certain ways the kind of constraints that it puts on you as a teacher and kind of what it forces you to prioritize is actually good for the classroom as a whole, which is super, super interesting.
Yeah, because it forces the children to get more independent. They teach each other more. Right.
Yeah, I'm also curious about this question. I don't know what I would bet, but I find it intriguing. So now we have a zillion questions from the audience. So there's a cluster of questions that I could ask you about COVID. So one is just the situation past year in terms of like lots of people were trying to do some kind of virtual school or hybrid thing where the parent was doing some education at home with help from a guide. And a lot of Montessori schools ended up doing something like this too, including a lot of our schools where, look, you'd get some presentations and some contact or some socialization via Zoom. But at least for a while, it was pretty locked down, and you were at home, and the parents were trying to supplement. And we even we like sent materials to people, and we tried a bunch of things. Is there anything like research on this, or do you even have opinions on like are there best practices here? Or what do we know? What don't we know? I'll let you just riff on that question.
So we have a little study that we're looking at the data from, just to see what happened and what sort of success people felt they had when they were from a Montessori versus a conventional school. So we'll see how that looks. And Angela Murray, I think it was with Katie Brown, also has worked on a study, and I think that may be just coming out in Journal of Montessori Research. So there's been a little bit, but I don't know of any other studies, unfortunately. All this came on us so quickly. But, talking anecdotally, I just heard some really interesting anecdotes about it. Like somebody describing to me a teacher who, got all the parents sort of set up and online with how to work things at home. And then they had the children in the Zoom windows. So it was a primary class, and the children were all, doing their work, washing their table or watering their plants or whatever, and they could see all the other children, and that, they felt like, it functioned okay. On the other hand, I just think there's no substitute for being together in person, except that it does allow things like this to happen.
Yeah.
This is pretty neat. I can't see all the people in the audience, but if they're sending questions, they must be there. So
there are many. So yeah.
So we do what we can, and one of the things about Montessori is it's adaptable. It's about adapting to different places. These amazing schools in Kenya, for instance, that are following the nomadic tribes and setting up a tent, and the children all go to the class. There's so many things that people have done to create materials when they can't afford to buy them, and so on. So
yeah, I love that answer. It's almost like, there's so many factors. Like one, I should get to people's questions, but I can't help. I just want to talk to you about this stuff. So there's like, if this were to happen for years and years, like you might imagine, like there's kind of like the equivalent of high fidelity here. There's a lot that goes into the execution of kind of making it work on the parents and the teachers end, and that's going to be a huge difference maker. And then there's just, this is the general approach of like, what are you comparing it to? Like, look, there's a global pandemic. People have to be at home. Human development doesn't stop. We use our best philosophy of human development that we have, Montessori or something cognitive to Montessori, and you adapt. Like that's what you do. And it's hard to like what do you want to say, like compare it to normal times? It's not normal times. And so that's not the comparison case. So lots to think about on this topic. And just one more thing on COVID. You mentioned that you had to throw out a bunch of data. I've heard here and there about research disruptions due to COVID. How bad is it? Is it setting you back a year or more? Or
we're starting over. Yeah. So the bad part is we had to start over because all of the children who we tested in the fall when they were 3, that we were intending to test in the spring when they were 3, the schools shut down. So we didn't even have 1 year of Montessori data. All we had was baseline. And then those children were all at home and getting who knows what. So we're starting over. So that's the bad news. The good news is that before COVID, we were having a lot more trouble getting schools to acquiesce to be in the study, or districts to acquiesce. And we've just been a lot more successful. It doesn't mean that everyone has said yes, but there's been a lot more willingness to participate. And so we're very hopeful that we're going to have.
Why is that?
Sample of 660. Well, it's not true of research generally. The Institute for Education Sciences folks told us that in general, schools are saying, no way, we're not doing research. And what we're thinking is it's because what we're asking them to do is let us check on a program that they're already doing. So they're already doing Montessori, or they're already doing conventional. We're not asking them to do anything different than what they already do. I think that's part of it. And I think it's partly just phew, back to normal, okay, we can do this. And maybe it's partly that there's not as much stuff on their desk as COVID is getting wiped away.
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah.
totally sure, but we thought the first reason is probably the most likely, that there's just been more willingness. Not every school has agreed to participate or found the time to help us out, but a lot more have than before COVID.
Well, that's awesome. Hopefully it ends up being
We've got half our sample
Yeah.
already consented, and so we just need another 350 to consent before September.
We have a question from Yari. Have you performed studies on Montessori benefits for children with special needs, or can you, if you haven't, can you speak to other research on this topic?
Yeah. I'll say that I don't feel like there's a solid body of evidence on this yet. It's a really good issue to study. The IES study is large enough that we will have probably enough of a sample to speak to it with that study. Like, I know that some of our schools, a third of the children are on some kind of an individual education plan, so some sort of special needs. How extreme it is, I'm not sure. But so there'll be something there as far as children who are in regular Montessori classrooms. But otherwise, there's a bit here and a bit there. But we need more on that. So we need people to, as graduate students or as researchers, decide that this is the issue that they want to study, and have them get into that. One of the issues is that because there aren't at any given school a large number of such children, one needs access to many such schools, or one goes to a school like the one in Dallas, Joanne Pickering's school. Am I getting her name right?
Yeah,
where you've got 1,200 children with special needs, and then you have to figure out, well, what's your comparison group? And I suppose it would be special needs children whose parents are similar at other schools. You don't have the lottery, and a lot of people say if you don't have the lottery, it may be something about the parents who chose it.
Yeah, I mean that's always part of the problem. Yeah, there's a school in Romania, I think, that I visited once that it's a sizable and kind of storied special needs school in the community that has a very strong Montessori influence. So yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of these things that's going to be hard to operationalize. Like what exactly are you kind of controlling for and measuring when you're looking for these outcomes? But these problems aren't, just so people know, these problems aren't completely unique to Montessori. This is just like education research is quite difficult. It's plagued by these problems. So we have an interesting question here. I don't know if you've noticed anything either in your research, your qualitative research, or just over your career. Are there common careers that a Montessori adolescent chooses to pursue?
That's actually a research question we want to ask. So from that big study, we have many emails from people that are willing to continue, and so we would like to go and ask that. It's just a question that we didn't think to ask in that survey, but I think it's a really good one. We have it from the really tiny qualitative study, but we should do it from the big study and just see, do they end up in different professions? Do we see more in engineering and math, for example? And what did they choose to major in college? I think also, because that may be different from the profession they go on to.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have a question here from Patricia Smith. And I'll ask the question and then I'll add a footnote to the question. How is the transition between being in a traditional university and being in a Montessori high school? How can you help them or help themselves to be confident? I heard that this is shocking for many. And my footnote is, how much research is there on Montessori adolescents, period? I mean, I know that there's research on adolescents who have been to Montessori, but like really looking at the programs themselves and students who are in those programs.
Yeah. Big area that much more is needed. So Kevin Ratoon and Chitset Mahai's two wonderful little studies with experience sampling method, looking at the experience while they're there, but otherwise, yeah, real dearth of it. My graduate student, Christina Carroll, who was a Montessori elementary teacher for 10 years before coming back to graduate school. She's really interested in the elementary because there's not even much on elementary besides just test score studies. There's the wonderful study that Solange Dennerville, actually many studies from the same sample that have been coming out in the last year or two, but yeah, not much, and we'd like more. When it comes to transitions, so we asked everybody in the qualitative study that I just told you about, how was the transition? And this is in the paper. Most of them said not a problem. It was not a big deal. A couple of them said it was difficult. But then when we went back and said, well, do you wish you'd never gone to Montessori? Heck, no. I wish that all school was like Montessori. So, but I've had people make comments to me like, well, once I got to conventional school, it was really easy because they told you, read these pages and then we're going to test you. But at Montessori, I had to constantly be making choices and decide what I was going to do, and that was actually more challenging. So the challenge could go either way. I think that for the most part, Montessori is a lot more like college, or especially more like graduate school. And so I'm surprised to hear people saying it's more difficult to transition. I will say that there is one study that lumped Montessori with Steiner and another alternative curriculum by Rebecca Shankland, spelled Shankland. And I'm not remembering the year right now, but it was looking at the mental health of people when they go to college, controlling for their mental health in the year before they went to university. This was a European study. And they found that people who had been in alternative education had significantly better mental health in university than people who had been at traditional schools before that. So it may be that there's some people who it's really difficult for, but studies aren't suggesting that for the majority it's difficult.
Anecdotally, something that I've heard a lot, especially with people that went to Montessori elementary as well as early childhood, is like middle school and high school were tough, and then college felt like Montessori again. Like that kind of pattern is something that you hear. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me that Montessori students have better health. None of it really surprises me. So this is all confirming my priors, which is the nice thing about your research. But yeah, Montessori's critique of the university system and the last appendix of From Childhood to Adolescence, I was just rereading it recently. It's incredibly applicable. Like if you go and read it, you're like, when did she write this, in the 90s? Like it feels like it's written for today.
Yeah.
We have a really good question here from Donna. Just to frame this question for the audience, so Montessori is a stage theorist. She thinks that there are planes of development and that you move through these 4 planes and that they happen in roughly 6-year intervals. And a lot of, and many, she's not the only stage theorist, many developmentalists are stage theorists. And a lot of stage theorists take their stages kind of into adulthood, like Erickson and Kohlberg, but Montessori doesn't. So you kind of like get to 18 and then you're an adult and that's the last plane. And so this question from Donna, I think that this is what she's getting at. Has there been research to expand on the 4 planes of development?
Well, so the last plane ends at 24, and that, there's a lot of neuroscience research suggesting that there's a lot of kind of gelling of things in the brain. So yes, the brain continues to change throughout life, but it's plasticity at a different level than the kind of plasticity that happens earlier. The periods of time that Montessori saw as kind of demarcating different ways of thinking, different ways of being in the world, 1 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 18, 18 to 24, are ones that many people have seen before and after her. They are just the common developmental psychology stages. And that's because I think there's some biological truth to them. There's, puberty and, the teeth coming in and the like. And that's natural that would be tied together. And it's why most cultures start school at 6 or 7. So now efforts to go beyond it, like Erickson did, I mean, I would actually say that at least the developmental psychology I know, the rarity is to talk about stages later in life.
Yeah.
And many developmental psychology science folks don't really put much stock in Erickson because the research doesn't support it that well for all people. There is this issue of lifespan development versus child development. And the notion is that child development is much more biologically driven and much more normative. So many children, of course, every child's their own unique self, but many children go through things in a similar way. When you get to adulthood, there's huge variation in when people's health declines in certain ways and when their memory declines. I mean, we all know people that are 95 whose minds are working great, and people who are 50 and they're getting early onset Alzheimer's. And so that's the issue with finding stages in adulthood, is that there's just a lot more variation. It's a lot more idiosyncratic. And so it's harder to pin down. And so you start thinking about, it's much more idiographic than any individual. What are they going through now and why? And what are all the circumstances leading to that? It's not as easily tapped into changes that are going on biologically as the organism's genetic programs unfolding in response to the environment.
Yeah, I think a lot of the narratives around development, like if you just take, I don't know, common Western, or at least the ones that I grew up with, it's like, you're a kid and that's hard, and then you're a teenager and that's even harder, and then you're an adult and then you have a midlife crisis, and like there's like a whole kind of span. But part of the idea in developmental research that is like some of these are like really pretty canalized biologically, and like midlife crises aren't like, you might seem like compelling and kind of a piece, but it's really a different kind of thing. There was a great question that I now can't find. I lost it in the list, but somebody was asking about if there's been any data or research looking at not comparing Montessori to non-Montessori in a kind of general way, but Montessori to like other developmental approaches, in particular Waldorf or Reggio Emilia, or any of the kind of big well-recognized approaches in early childhood.
Yeah, so one large study is Ansari and Winsler did a study in 2014 on children who were finishing kindergarten, and when they were 4, either gone to Montessori or high scope in public schools in Miami-Dade County in Florida. And then they followed them up in 3rd grade. And it's a large study. And what it showed was that Black children did just as well in high scope as they did in Montessori. And Hispanic children did better in Montessori than they did in high scope. One of the critiques of that study is that these schools are in different neighborhoods. Miami is kind of segregated, so there were Black neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods, and they didn't really have a good check on the fidelity of the Montessori. The principals told them that it was very high fidelity, except for the fact that they weren't multi-age classrooms, which is, pretty big deal. But so there's that study that's a specific comparison. And then there's a few studies out there that are specific comparisons of children's drawing creativity when they went to, Waldorf Steiner schools versus Montessori. And that sort of feels unfair,
right, yeah.
since sort of all they are doing all day, it's like, well, let's look at their reading, that it would be like comparing the reading skills of children in Waldorf versus Montessori. It would be completely unfair because they're not teaching that. Now, when it comes to creative problem solving, I think that's the study that should be done, comparing those approaches as opposed to just, how creative are their drawings looking. Not that children can't do amazingly beautifully creative drawings with the metal insets, but they're doing so many other things. And
it's the whole focus. Yeah, it's like comparing Math Olympiad camp to like
Yeah. So then you go back to the studies in the 70s where they were randomly assigned to Berdal Ingerman, which turned into direct instruction, and then the Darcy method. And those ones too, it was, it was Head Start, so it was only 4-year-olds in the classroom. The Montessori was really poorly implemented. They did see some, for the Montessori boys in particular, outcomes that were different when they were in 9th and 10th grade. But who knows if it wasn't just that it was a really small sample that made the Montessori, just by chance, the Montessori boys were excelling. But I will say that I feel like this big study is going to be great to look at this with, because I have seen hints here and there in my data that particularly low-income boys thrive in a Montessori environment, and maybe it's, there's like, one could speculate on why that might be, but again, it's only hints that I see in the data, and something I want to keep my eyes open for in case we see it more.
I might be manufacturing this, so feel free to just tell me that I'm wrong. But I feel like I remember research that shows that Montessori, differentially compared to other kind of like specific developmental approaches, and you would expect this, has kind of better fine motor outcomes.
Yeah, there are some. I just don't know that there was specific, like what specific other ones. There are definitely studies showing, but I can't remember like some particular program, except there is one study that I don't get this at all. It compares it to constructivist education. But what is Montessori if it's not also constructivist?
That's like comparing apples and fruit.
Yeah, so I didn't get that at all. Maybe they meant a Dewey school in particular,
Yeah,
but they
probably.
didn't say that. So yeah, so that's, I can't think of others, but in our study we will be the big study I'm doing with the American Institutes of Research AIR. We will be looking at what all the counterfactuals are, what other programs are children in, and if there's a large enough number in some specific one, we'll do exploratory analyses on that.
Awesome. Monica has a question that I often have, and I've probably asked you, and we've probably talked about. How can private Montessori, she asked specifically for elementary schools, but in general, how can private independent Montessori schools contribute to more research? Is it hard just because, like, look, you're going to get selection effects and that's just the name of the game, or is there something that we can be doing to help?
Well, if they wanted to admit randomly by lottery, if they were oversubscribed, that would help. But they don't tend to want to. However, it does help when they participate. Every school that participates, we go to private schools a lot. We're doing some studies now on motivation to look at the motivation of children who are in elementary and middle school and see whether Montessori children express more motivation, which is aligned with some of the Ratun and Shitset-Mahai findings, but we thought it should be looked at again. So no, very helpful. It's just that we need to control then for as many parent features as we can think of. And, when you do research, no one study is the magic bullet. You just need to keep going at it this way and this way and this way. And someday there's enough evidence that people start to say, yeah, maybe there's something to this. So we're just trying to get it all. And we really appreciate if you're a private school and you're willing to participate in research, please email me, because we're always saying, gosh, we need a school. Where can we find a school to be in this study? So email me, lillard@virginia.edu, and we'll save your name. And when we've got a study going on, we'll contact you and see if you would be willing to participate then.
Yeah, definitely do that. That's lillard@virginia.edu.
Yes. Google awesome. My name, you'll see it.
Yep. So this is one of the hardest Q&As I've ever done, because everything that you say, I just want to start talking to you, but there is a big queue of questions and we've only got 5 minutes. So can you speak to the importance of emotional development in a Montessori classroom? I noticed, you definitely use some social emotional metrics in your work, and you were just talking about in the longitudinal, or the I don't know if it's longitudinal, but the general well-being study. A lot of those metrics were emotional, but can you talk about some of the research there?
Yeah, so for example, just a recent one from Solange Denervaux that I think is really a neat finding is that children in Montessori classrooms are faster to pick up people's emotional expressions. They're reading emotional expressions more quickly than children in conventional schools. And, why would this be? Well, all this natural interaction that's happening, rather than everybody a lot of the time facing a teacher or just focused on a problem, there's a lot more sort of engagement with others. And it just strikes me, it's so much more of a natural environment. And Montessori's theory is that it's that deep concentration, which I think maybe, well, you've got Csikszentmihalyi's flow findings that when adults really deeply concentrate, they do feel good afterwards. And then we've got all the research coming out from meditation, and that's often people concentrating really hard on their breath or some object, and that these things seem to set the system right in a way, our biological, emotional, our HPA axis. And that's what Montessori thought that she saw, that once children were really deeply concentrating, that you saw this change go on where it was like some inner needs were being met. And when our inner needs are being met, we're more able to give to others, to be kind to others. Somebody was describing to me the other day that she decided to really get into Montessori when she was doing some school programs. She was working at the after school at a Montessori school, and then she was maybe doing a photography program at a conventional school, and she would sometimes substitute in other grades at the Montessori. And she described being in a classroom where there was a child with special needs, very severe autism, but not so severe that he couldn't be in the classroom. And she said that she watched how the children in middle school made sure there was room for him on the circle, tried to just really include him and engage him. And then she's at this other highfalutin private school, and it was just, the children just weren't nice to each other. And she thought, there is something to this. So I think when Montessori is going well, when it's really able to express itself in its fullness and its high fidelity fullness, so teachers who really understand the system and what they're doing and have had enough time in the classroom doing it in the right way, that the children are starting to settle in. I know in the beginning it can be crazy. That you do, it seems to me, see these changes, and some of our data express that. Remember, not every one of the schools I'm doing research in is as high fidelity as some of the other ones, and like even though the lottery ones have been AMI recognized, not every teacher in there was a fantastic teacher. Some people get really good training and they just do their own thing anyway. So I think classroom by classroom, and that means that study by study, because none of them are huge, you might not always see these findings, but you see them enough, and it makes sense theoretically that I think that there really is something to the social emotional growth that's able to happen. And we see it in those qualitative responses in the last study I told you about too.
Yeah, I think that that's a great note to end on. I mean, this is something that in one of these internecine within Montessori disputes in the 50s, when Mario Montessori was like, this is what Montessori is and this is what Montessori isn't, her son had opinions about this. The thing that he elevated and identified, it's like, it's not about freedom or materials or activities, or, I mean, all these things are important, but, or learning to learn or curiosity. It's about work in a certain way that like elevates you spiritually and morally. And it was these two things that he felt like Montessori was like unique in. And so I'm really glad to see that you see some of that in the research. And I think it's a great note to end on. Thank you so much. This was such a lovely talk and such a lovely conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the conference, and thank you all for you all's work around the world and helping with children and helping the planet, helping the earth to be able to survive the ravages that much of humanity's put on, to try to help children to come up to be able to deal with these challenges and help each other and help all of life. So thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
Thank you, Angela. Enjoy your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.